Good day, everyone. Welcome to this conference. Wherever you're in the world, I'd like to welcome you. I know we have people from Africa, across Asia, India, Australia, the Asia-Pacific region, the Middle East, Europe, United States, and even Latin America. Welcome. Welcome to this conference, a very important topic on the issue of unveiling the uncounted costs of conflicts, the war on climate. We are here today to discuss and make clear certain issues related to the war on climate, which are so often ignored. The flow today will be rather simple, but rather intense. We will have essentially, after I make these introductory remarks, a video. We'll start with that, a documentary of about 7 minutes. After that, we'll have the keynote speaker, Dr. Grace Pandor, and then a panel that will discuss both the video, the contents of a report, and how we should take this forward in terms of both getting this on the agenda of international organizations and the activism that is so much needed. My name is Chandra Nair. I'm the founder and CEO of the Global Institute for Tomorrow. We are extremely honored and privileged to have this opportunity to host this all-important conference. It is actually a world first. During this conference, for 90 minutes, we will have the premiere of a documentary that is also a world first that will expose the issues related to conflict and the significant impacts it has on climate and environmental damage. Not just wars, but the entire, if I could call it, the chain of events related to conflict, even peacetime activities with regard to preparations for conflict emit huge amounts of emissions that are unaccounted for. So we are very privileged to do this, and we'll be discussing a topic that is so obvious in many ways, but has been hidden from most of us, even those of us who have been engaged in climate discussions for a long time. And it's no wonder that there has been almost an active effort in international circles to keep the emissions that are generated from conflict from being accountable. So I'll just say that this conference today is not about demilitarization or about peace. As important as those two objectives are, and so many of us around the world wish we had more peace, a peace industry, and less militarization. But this is not what this conference is about. This conference is about the need to make that vital link between preparation for conflict, even the industry of conflict, because there are many economic incentives for conflict. And to look at the links between that and the contributions to climate change beyond the act of war itself and during the acts of war, and the great significant environmental damage that all of this causes to the world. These facts, the data have all been hidden. So this process is to really get us to start to monitor and report and get the international organizations and the countries, all signatories to the various climate agreements, to agree to the reporting of military and conflict emissions so that they can be made accountable. And we start today these discussions so that we can activate people around the world, not just the grassroots, but policymakers as well, so that this very obvious source of emissions, but which also are the cause of great suffering around the world, are not separated and begin to be embedded within the international agreements. So as I said, we'll start with the documentary. We'll then have a keynote speech by our very distinguished guest, special guest, who I'll introduce after the documentary. We'll then have a panel discussion where I'll have 5 people who are involved, both in the video, the production of the report that includes the data, an expert on the topic of climate and the policy issues related to how do you get it into the system so that actors are made accountable. And then people who come from the grassroots are involved in activating the public, both locally and globally, to take these issues on and build a global movement. So we'll also have a Q&A session at the end of the panel discussion, and then finally a call for action. So let me start first by then inviting you all to watch a short documentary about 7 minutes, which highlights why this issue of conflicts and the significant impact it has on emissions and environmental damage around the world needs to be put right at the center of our discussions about climate change and environmental damage. Welcome, and please watch for 7 minutes.
Technology has offered the world's military ever more effective means of killing and maiming. But the unintended victim of their aggression? Our planet. In May 1990, the US Navy released a discussion paper confronting a stark reality. Human activity was altering the weather. This was the first official signal that defense forces would need to prepare for threats of a different kind. The rising seas and catastrophic weather that would reshape the battlefield and the combatants they would face. In the years that followed, it seemed that the entire world was acknowledging this new reality.
From any country. The imperative here is to do what we promise rather than to promise what we cannot do.
By 1997, 116 nations signed the Kyoto Protocol. It was a declaration of profound change, an unprecedented moment of togetherness as the world united in facing an existential threat to us all. Despite the promises,
we will meet our greenhouse gas limitation target for the purposes of the Kyoto Protocol.
Carbon emissions have soared, and with them, seas and global temperatures.
In a period of 6 weeks from late July to the end of August, over 15,000 people were killed in France by heat exhaustion, dehydration, and heat stroke.
Each year, the situation deteriorates. Whilst our response remains woefully inadequate.
To getting a binding framework of action after the Kyoto Protocol expires in 2012.
Copenhagen.
That's why I come here today, not to talk.
Cancun.
Cancun will be successful.
Durban.
The issue of the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol.
Paris, Glasgow, Dubai.
There is 30% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now.
3 decades of talk and treaties. But no action.
The climate deal is unanimous, an outpouring of emotion.
Yes, we have achieved the Paris Agreement.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
Why has the climate crisis spiraled out of control despite our efforts? The truth is, fossil fuels remained central to our way of life. And when those supplies were threatened, the response was not more innovation, but more conflict. Wars were fought to secure the resources that power both conflict and climate destruction. Oil, coal, gas.
The whole world is looking up to us for guidance and anxiously awaiting the outcome of this conference.
The truth was that the Kyoto Agreement had a hidden clause. Military emissions, the most carbon-intensive activity on the planet, were given a free pass. the industries and activities that consume the most fossil fuels exempted themselves from monitoring. Their emissions kept secret. Their impact on the climate crisis unchecked. And with every climate conference that followed, this exemption remained. It wasn't until the 2015 Paris Agreement that it was overturned, but only to be replaced with a voluntary reporting requirement. Few volunteered. And yet war is one of the greatest drivers of climate change. Global military forces are responsible for approximately 6% of all carbon emissions annually, more than many countries. It's far more than fuel-hungry fleets of tanks, planes and ships, but also the vast supply chains and infrastructure developed to support combat, all powered by fossil fuels. The war on terror alone was responsible for 1.2 billion tons of greenhouse gas since it began, with yearly emissions equivalent to a nation the size of Sweden. While the first 3 months of the war in Gaza led to new emissions greater than those of 26 individual countries annually. But emissions only tell a fraction of the story. War leaves behind more than the tragedy of human loss. It scars the land, destroying ecosystems and poisoning the earth. Rebuilding lost infrastructure generates vast amounts of emissions and poisons. The consequences of every individual war are felt across the entire planet for generations. Conflict and militarism fuel the destruction of both people and the planet in pursuit of resources that only accelerate the crisis. The results of this failure are unmistakable. Every second year, another 1 in 1,000-year storm, a devastating fire destroying forests. Nature, pushed to its limit, is striking back. The bitter irony.
Today, no nation can find lasting security without addressing the climate crisis. We face all kinds of threats in our line of work, but few of them truly deserve to be called existential.
The military wage wars for oil, knowing that it will hasten the climate catastrophe. This is why they sought to be, and remain, excluded from emissions reporting. The global military's addiction to oil, their addiction to secrecy, and their addiction to war must end. The global military has declared war on climate, and now the climate is fighting back. The real question is, whose side will we choose?
Welcome back, everyone. I've been someone who's been involved in these environmental climate discussions for a long time. And what struck me most about the video, apart from the very, very saddening view that we failed, is also that even those of us who are involved have never seen a video or 7 minutes, I've never seen one, that explicitly made the link between war, conflict, and the devastating impacts on climate and natural systems and nature and the environment. And you have to ask, why? Why is it being sort of hidden away? So today we start on a journey, a single step of 1,000 miles, to make this connection explicitly clear to a world that, even though concerned, not everyone concerned, where we have so far failed, not something that we want to acknowledge easily, that we need to also address the industry of conflict, which generates so much, and make sure that this is now become mainstream. The media groups around the world, mainstream, will essentially start to make those linkages rather than scare away or even actively participate in deception. So that's a big takeaway for me from what I saw, having been not someone new to these issues, but how easily it has been buried and not connected. So let's start connecting the dots. I've already seen a lot of questions coming through. So anyone who's got questions, please put them through. If we can't answer them today, they will be essentially assembled in ways that will build the body of knowledge and inquiry needed to make this issue mainstream. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Pandole. Dr. Pandole, welcome. And can I first say that I address you as a fan? So excuse my exuberance at the opportunity to meet you and say hello to you. For several months last year, I turned on the TV to watch you every time. You spoke at the UN about the conflict in Gaza, and your eloquent and passionate sort of appeal for circumstances to change. So those of you who do not know Dr. Pandole, I will not go through her distinguished career and achievements, apart to say that until a few months ago, she was the foreign minister of the South African government. Dr. Pandole, welcome. The floor is yours, and we're all waiting to hear your remarks on this very complex but vitally important issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Nair. I'm just in receipt of a message, which is rather frightening, about Gaza, which indicates that the UN Office for Humanitarian Affairs has reported that all bakeries in Gaza are closed, as no fuel is being allowed in to run them, and there's virtually no flour to make bread. Secondly, a minimum of 608 trucks a day is what is needed to sustain life in Gaza, but only 487 aid trucks have been allowed in the past 3 weeks. So these are the frightening circumstances that the people of Gaza and Palestine are living in day to day. Nonetheless, let me come to the discussion of today. And I begin by greeting all participants from an unusually cold and snowy South Africa. I believe that this webinar on the uncounted cost of conflict and its contribution to climate change impacts of natural disasters, harmful emissions, food insecurity, and tons of harmful debris is a timely and very relevant conference today. We have a great deal said by policymakers on the subject of climate change, but their focus tends to be more financing or greater investment in innovation and research, and sometimes deliberations about technology transfer. It is very rare to hear any of them acknowledge the harm that conflict and war cause to the agenda of creating a resilient, sustainable environment. Today, world leaders, particularly those of the richest North, are basically preparing for increased arms production, more investment in the defense sector, and the development of a more sophisticated ability to kill and destroy. All this in the face of a vastly increased inequality, severe poverty and malnutrition, and a worrying reduction in international aid for developing countries. There is no leadership in our globe for peace, despite growing evidence of the destructive impact of conflict. Climate conference resolutions focus on waste management, plastics waste reduction, and other climate effect management strategies, but none of them give attention to managing the waste of damaged infrastructure, of increased emissions from armaments, and of increased human insecurity, a subject we rarely discuss. A recent meeting of the African Union Peace and Security Council reflected on this link between conflict and climate change. They asserted that investigations by the AU reveal a strong link between climate change and conflict. They referred to environmental pressure over scarce resources, which has increased by irregular community displacement, as well as the failure of public policy and public institutional capacity to address the need to respond to these crises. All of these inadequacies fuel increased climate effects. There's a wide body of research on this subject, and increased attention must be given to the nexus between conflict arms proliferation, infrastructure collapse, and climate change effects. The UN, our world's premier multilateral body, needs to play an expanded role in promoting peace and conflict prevention and a reduction in lethal weapons in the globe. I don't think we can discuss this subject without talking about demilitarization or reducing the proliferation of arms throughout the world. We need to have initiatives directed at supporting community economic development and the building of stable democracies which respond to the needs of the most marginalized and vulnerable. We need to create conditions in which peace can support stability and focused responses to climate change. I think if you have a situation of conflict, you cannot pay attention to all that needs to be done to respond to climate change effects or to reduce their harm. I believe I should conclude by stressing that conflict harms the progress we have made in gender equality, as women are vastly affected by war and the harmful impacts of climate change. This is particularly true for the large populations of rural women in many parts of Africa. Their dire circumstances are made worse by the impact of conflict and by the degradation of climate change effects. We need a dedicated, effective peace movement linked to environmental sustainability. I think it would add value to all our deliberations on the subject of climate change. But most significantly, I believe such a peace movement would benefit the poor and most vulnerable greatly. And that should really be the world's condition, changing the condition of the most marginalized, of the poorest, so that we can together attend to the difficult subject of addressing climate change. I wish you well in your deliberations, and I hope all of us will join a global movement for peace. Thank you very much to you all.
Dr. Pando, thank you very much. I have one question and then I'll let you go, but I'm sure we have a couple of minutes more. And one of the questions that is typically asked is, and I'm not sure that you might have the answer, but I thought it's worth asking, given that you have worked in diplomatic circles for so long. What would it take for diplomatic circles to put something like this on the agenda? And I know there's what they call a North-South divide. The highly industrialized and militarized nations may not want to talk about it. But can you give us some hint of what do you think countries could do beyond the divide and getting diplomats to be at the forefront of taking the issue forward and not shying away from it? I hope that's not an unfair question.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether diplomats throughout the world would give consideration, because, as I have said, it is the wealthiest that are fueling a large proportion of the conflicts that we're seeing in the world. So there is an economic benefit to conflict. What we need to do is begin to end the economic benefit. And I think one of the things we should encourage is that organizations of the global south should have on their agenda attention to the impact of conflict and not see it as unrelated to other development priorities. I think institutions such as BRICS and the G20, where there's a large presence of the South, should be encouraged to discuss these matters more cogently. We also should really encourage the civil society organs of the United Nations body to have more deliberations on this subject, because the effects are so obvious and so terrible that it is worrying that very little attention is given to them. So I think organizationally, we need to begin to insist more stringently and vocally that these issues are placed on the global agenda of a range of fora.
Tavanda, you've just given us all immense inspiration. And in terms of a follow-up call for action, I can see at least us taking a lead in getting the diplomats onto an agenda, especially those from what I call the global majority or the global south, whatever people call it, to actually form some sort of a diplomatic circle to address what you've already identified as critical, that you can't address poverty alleviation. You can't, in fact, address even your climate issues if you have conflict and that industry of conflict continues to create unsettled conditions. And then you mentioned the gender issue as well. And I can see an opportunity for those of us who live in the countries of the global majority to start putting some serious work, building a body of knowledge to look at how that gets inserted into the diplomacy, a new form of diplomacy perhaps, and to take this forward. But when I wish we could have you for longer. We will certainly want to have you back as this process continues. You're an early patron of this idea, and I thank you so much. I hope you will be able to stay if your time allows you, because we will continue the discussion for the next hour. But I'm sure many people have got a lot of questions coming in. We can't offer it all to you, but we'll send a few to you by email if you're interested, and we will continue this conversation. Thank you for your insights. And most importantly,
you very much for the opportunity. I will stay on for a while.
Yeah,
thank you.
And thank you for the inspiration.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we move on to the third segment of our webinar, which is to have a panel discussion. The nature of the panel discussion is to bring on 5 individuals who will provide us with perspectives that I hope will give us all a food for thought, start bringing together the very important understanding of the crucial nature of this issue, bring together facts that will allow us to digest and further analyze how these problems are being created, and to essentially also allow us to start to connect with each other and take the conversation forward. There's a lot of work to be done if we are to mainstream it, and as Dr. Pandor said, to essentially get our governments to stop hiding from the truth. As she made very clear, there is a divide between the rich industrialized countries and the others, but the others too have sometimes vested interests in conflicts. So allow me just a couple of minutes quickly to introduce our panel members and then start the panel discussion. So first, it's my great pleasure to have the producer of the documentary, Joel Pront, who is a documentary filmmaker based in Australia, and his extremely long career involved in allowing us to understand complex issues around conflict, etc., and being very committed to exploring the effects of the military and its associated activities on the climate. Joe, welcome.
Thank you, Chandran. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to welcome the author of the report, which in some ways one could almost say is seminal in terms of being one of the few around. And interestingly, there's so few around that essentially starts to put some of the critical data together around the issues of the war on climate and the accounting for the climate impacts. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sharosh Abdul Fatih, who, and I hope I've not said it wrongly, Sharosh.
It's a difficult name, Chandran, so don't worry.
No, there's no difficulty. People like me should know better. But thank you for giving me that easy way out. Is an associate professor at Warwick University in the UK, and a co-lead on the global research priorities in sustainable cities. He's the key author of the research that is the full report he will talk about, will be released soon, but is one of the first, and maybe even the first, and he will let us know, that starts to connect some very inconvenient truths about climate and the conflict industry, if I can call it, or the whole complex issues of how conflicts are sustained and the economic interests that sustain them and the impacts. So, Dr. Sharosh, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome. Next, I would like to welcome Professor Brendan McKay, who is a distinguished professor and director of the Climate Action Beacon at Griffith University in Australia. A seasoned practitioner, decades of involvement in all the issues that we're talking about here. And Brendan was a coordinating lead author for the IPCC sixth assessment report. Extremely familiar with the issues, the technical issues, but dare I say even the politics. And he's here to tell us how these things work and how this sort of information needs to be worked through as a global movement so that it can be embedded, accepted, and then become part of the mainstream. So welcome, Brendan.
Yeah, thank you, Chandran.
Next, I'd like to welcome Teresa Bean. Teresa, welcome. Good morning from in the UK, who leads research at a very interesting and important organization called In Place of War, focusing on research papers, etc., but very importantly, a research on art-based social movements and how to essentially create awareness within communities from the grassroots upwards using art, and particularly in relation to reducing conflict. And Teresa will speak a lot more about her activities, and particularly how her organization and the associated organizations she works with can be an inspiration for us to create a global movement as well. Welcome, Teresa.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
And last but not least, Vanessa Nakata. Vanessa is an environmentalist and, dare I say, a global influencer, even the most famous of all of us here today. Vanessa is co-founder of the TAD Foundation. She's the author of Bigger Picture, a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, and a member of the board of the Malawi Fund and Global Witness. Vanessa has been outspoken and regarded around the world as a youth champion for global mobilization of the youth to address these complex issues of climate change and environmental degradation. So welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you so much.
So I'll start by inviting Joel to spend about 5 minutes or so, Joel, to tell us about the excellent video you've produced and your key messages so that we go away understanding what this is really all about. Thank you. Joel, over to you.
I'll give you a little bit of background. At the start of 2020, I was on the Venezuelan and Colombian border working on a documentary about the refugee crisis when the pandemic hit. Suddenly, I found myself returning home to Australia, only to step into a nation that was literally on fire. The entire East Coast was burning. They called it a 1 in 1,000 year event, But in the years since, we've had 3 catastrophic floods, one just last month. Each one unprecedented, each one record-breaking, each one a 1 in 1,000-year disaster. But this isn't just my country's story. What's happening in Australia is happening everywhere. Homes collapsing into the sea on America's east coast, devastating fires in Greece, Canada, Los Angeles, historic floods in Spain, Libya, Nigeria, entire Pacific nations threatened due to rising sea levels. The list goes on. This is our reality now, not the exception, the norm. So the question isn't, is this happening? It's what do we do about it? That's why I was so drawn to this issue, because in the face of these disasters and these urgent calls to cut emissions, both as individuals and as nations, there's a vast sector of society not just dragging its feet, but actively hiding its contribution to the crisis, the military. It feels ironic because these are the very institutions that were among the first to recognize climate change as a serious threat. And yet, when it came to reducing their own emissions, they had carved out a loophole. This documentary began as a way to explore that contradiction, to understand how institutions that exist to protect us could be contributing so heavily to a threat that endangers us all, and how, over time, the system designed to hold them accountable had been quietly dismantled or ignored. It started with the Kyoto Protocol, the world's first legally binding climate treaty. During negotiations, the United States demanded that all the military emissions be excluded. There was some pushback, so a compromise was reached. Reporting would be voluntary. And as you might guess, very few volunteered. And now, decades later, we find ourselves in a situation where the global military sector is responsible for around 6% of the world's total emissions. That's more than the entire country of Russia. But here's what really surprised me. War itself is just one part of the picture. Military emissions begin long before the first shots are fired. The building of bases, the constant movement of troops and equipment, the operation of entire logistical networks, it all consumes staggering amounts of fuel. Transport alone accounts for about half of military emissions. To give just one example, fueling a single Abrams tank for a day uses as much fuel as a small car would in a year, and there are 10,000 of them currently in service. Or consider the fact that the United States operates over 750 military bases across the globe, none of which give any consideration to emissions. Then, of course, there's the fighting itself. War accelerates environmental destruction. During the Vietnam War, the use of Agent Orange destroyed over 3 million hectares of forest, about 18% of the country's tree cover. The so-called War on Terror is estimated to have released 1.2 billion tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And when the fighting stops, the emissions don't. Rebuilding can be just as polluting. The war in Gaza, for example, has left the region in ruins. Early estimates suggest that reconstruction alone could generate over 60 billion tons of CO2, mostly from the concrete needed to rebuild what's been lost. So what can we do? The first step is simple and long overdue. Military emissions must be measured, tracked, and made public, because we can't change what we don't know about. The next step is to reduce those emissions, not by disarming, but by rethinking the way militaries operate. This isn't about weakening national security, it's about strengthening it in a way that doesn't come off at the cost of planetary security. We need militaries that run on clean energy, not fossil fuels. We need defense forces that protect not just borders, but futures. And more than anything, we need fewer wars, less conflict, more diplomacy, and more peace. Thank you, Chandra.
Joel, thank you so much. So well said. I was taken by some of the key points you made, and I'll just ask you one thing about the systemic dismantling of the attempts to put together an accountability and reporting mechanism. How long has that been going on, and how? And I mean, I know you gave some examples, but is that still
it really began as soon as the world started taking notice and counting emissions with the Kyoto Protocol, and the United States was at the forefront of repressing emissions counting and has done ever since. Some, well, very few, generally countries with smaller militaries do report on their emissions, but they're inconsequential as compared with the bigger militaries in the world, China, the US, Russia, India. So really, and since the Kyoto Protocol, which was really the start of emissions counting or the global stocktake, they've been excluded.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you for making also the point that that the military emissions is not just during the war, and giving us some numbers about how the logistics and mobilization phase and the constant preparedness for war is such a huge huge contributor, and also that very important point you made that the emissions don't stop when the fighting stops, and
exactly,
and it goes on, and there's asbestos and groundwater contamination, all of those things that are related to emissions, but also related to all sorts of other environmental degradation. Joel, thank you. Stay on as you will, and then we'll have a conversation with lots of questions.
Great.
But a brilliant start. Thank you, and well-made documentary. Thank you for that contribution. Now I'd like to invite Sarosh Abdulfatih. I hope I've got it better right this time, Sarosh, and the author of this very important groundbreaking report. And Sarosh, over to you. Tell us a bit more about what the report is, the challenges you face, the data you've got, the data you could not get, and all of those things. But please give us some insights. Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks everyone for being here. Today I'm going to talk about the study that we conducted called From Conflict to Climate Crisis, How Wars Shape Future Environment. So let me start with some context. In 2024, over 92 countries were engaged in military operations. That's nearly half of the world. We now face the highest number of conflicts since the Second World War. At the moment, we have 56 ongoing wars globally. These are not only humanitarian crises, they are environmental catastrophes in disguise. Military activities from, fuel-intensive operations on a day-to-day basis to the disposal of decommissioned equipment and so on contributes to more than 5% of global greenhouse gas emission. And as it's already mentioned, this is more than annual emissions of entire nations such as Russia. And we all know Russia is not a small country. It's a vast territory, and its entire emission is less than military emissions. So that's more than people we already imagine. Yet military emissions are largely invisible, hidden by exemptions in international treaties like Kyoto Protocol, and completely omitted from the Paris Accords monitoring mechanism. This is such an important thing that we cannot monitor these emissions. So these 5% that I'm talking about right now is largely estimates, well, educated estimates. And we are in a situation that currently only 4 Annex 1 countries reported any military emissions to the UNFCCC last year, right? So none from the global south did report their military emissions, right? And for those of you who don't know what is Annex 1 countries, Annex 1 countries are, according to the UNFCCC, industrialized nations and economies in transition that have committed to specific climate action targets under the Kyoto Protocol. So our estimates suggest that the actual emissions from military activities could be 10 times higher than what's already reported. It just shows, the stark reality. So this secrecy is no accident. It stems from long history of shielding military operations from climate accountability. But there's a question I think we must ask. If climate crisis threatens our national security, why are we not including the military in our climate policies? Right? In fact, we are doing the opposite right now. While global military budgets rose sharply, I mean, all of you have heard in the news in the past maybe few months about, increasing spendings on military in Europe, NATO countries, China, Russia, Middle East, and so on. At the moment, we are spending 30 times more on militaries than on climate action, right? So what happens as a result? Well, the more escalating conflicts, the more degradation of forests, the more polluted water system, the more destroy of agricultural land, and more displacement of millions of people, as we can see nowadays happening in several war zones around the world. So in war zones, the environment is collateral damage. And in post-conflict recovery, environmental restoration is rarely a priority, even though local population often depends on degraded ecosystems for their survival. So, as I think all of you agree with me, this cycle is vicious. Environmental degradation breeds conflict, and conflict accelerates environmental collapse. Without peace, the planet cannot heal, right? Yet, governments continue to frame climate action as an individual responsibility. Turn off your lights, recycle, drive less, fly less, these kind of actions, while ignoring the elephant in the room, the institutionalized destruction that is war. So our research aims to bring that reality into focus by systematically reviewing military-related environmental impacts across 4 stages: before conflicts, during conflicts, after conflicts, and long-term recovery. So the emissions during that long-term recovery. We show how war is a climate issue, not just a security or human rights issue. And we also explore overlooked themes. So not only looking at GHG emissions of military, which is something that many people have spoken about, but looking at water resources and water security, looking at land, agriculture, and food security, as well as natural ecosystem, things like aquatic and terrestrial wildlife, forest, wetlands, and so on. So we find that military emissions rival those from global aviation and shipping combined, yet remain entirely outside global emission reduction frameworks, which, I mean, it just tells you the problem, right? Climate action plans still fail to account for military emissions. If we are to meet this 1.5-degree target from the Paris Agreement, which, by the way, we are already dangerously close to breaching, we must integrate military emissions into our climate strategies. Because without peace, there is no climate justice. Without transparency, there is no real accountability. And without international cooperation, we believe that there is no sustainable future. But let us be clear, our report and our study is not an argument against national security. We are not arguing about, demilitarization. That's not our study. But we are calling to redefine this, to rethink our military emission, to rethink our conflict and how we are going to conduct them in the future to minimize and make sure that we mitigate the climate impact of this. So our research urges policymakers, scholars, and international bodies to include military activities in climate negotiations, not as a footnote, but as a central pillar of any serious plan to combat climate change. And if I have to, our report is around 150 pages, so far too long. It It involved 263 published studies and around 35 international reports on military emissions and environmental impact of conflicts. But if I have to sort of summarize our study in one sentence,
yes,
I think we can tell you that we are drowning in data, yet starved for insight. Insight, so making sense, standardizing the data, making sure that everyone is reporting same things. This is something that we struggle to find in the literature. And I think I already gone above my 5 minutes.
Yeah,
So
well,
thank you.
just about, but it's I will bring you back when we open the conversation. But I have one question for you, which I thought you alluded to. I would have thought that one of the biggest challenges you would have had is getting hands on data on military, the activities and preparations, because many governments would see that as essentially part of the Official Secrets Act or confidential. So on one hand, you said you're drowning in data, but is that data from the government, from the military establishment, or is it secondary data?
There are a lot of the data are like patchy, right? So you have patchy data here and there. You get some data, for example, for a conflict that happened 20 years ago, right? But you don't necessarily get the data for current conflicts. And by the time that you get it, I mean, what can you do? You can just report, well, what happened in the past. So we think that a mechanism to report data more transparently, considering all the secrecy around these things. I mean, we have to be realistic, right? So we are not asking military to come and tell us all their, I don't know, secret plans.
Yes.
But we want to basically, what we urge them is that, well, let's work together to find a mechanism to report the data, right?
Great.
So they are main stakeholder here, and they should be engaged, I think, in all negotiations.
Thank you, sir. Such important work. I'm glad that the report is. Did you say 150 pages? But that's not too long. We need
supplementary
but
stuff.
Just amazing work. Groundbreaking, and I'm sure it'll set the standards for many others in different parts of the world to start embarking on the methodology and how to do all of this. So please stay with us. We'll get back to the discussion soon. Next speaker is Professor Brendan McKay. I've already introduced him because Professor McKay is very involved and being involved in the systems. We have given him a bit more time to say, well, how does it all work? And particularly, what are the mechanics of getting this issue essentially from a dismantled stage and back into the agendas and not hidden away? So, Professor McKay, over to you.
Yes, thank you. And as the previous couple of speakers have mentioned, we are dangerously close to breaching the Paris Agreement global warming target of 1.5 degrees. We are actually going to reach 1.5 degrees. We're going to hit it sometime around 2030, most likely. So the challenge is how close to 1.5 degrees can we keep global warming? Of course, the science is clear. With every increment of global warming, in particular over 1.5 degrees, we will experience increasingly irreversible impacts and loss and damage, and an increase in the severity and duration and frequency of all extreme weather events. And there's a scientific number called the carbon budget, and that's how, if you like, it's the permissible emissions. It's how much carbon emissions we can have to still limit global warming to about 1.5 degrees. And the number is about 65 billion tonnes of carbon, which is only about 6 years worth of current emissions. So it follows that every tonne of CO2 counts and must be counted. So as we've heard, if any source of emission, if any globally significant source of emission is not being reported and accounted for, then they're invisible from a policy perspective. So this is the issue. We've heard that the best I would say, ballpark figure we have for the contribution of military emissions. And as has been pointed out, that does not include the emissions from war and armed conflict and post-war reconstruction, just from military activity. And we know there's somewhere between 1.7 to $2 trillion a year being spent on military every year. That is a very significant amount. So 6% of global emissions. There's about 37.5 billion tons of CO2 emitted by humans every year from fossil fuel and deforestation and degradation. So 6% of that is very it's a lot. It's about 2.53 billion tons. As we've heard, it's comparable to countries. It's actually about the same as the EU 27 countries, right? So that's how significant it is. And it's more than international aviation shipping emissions, which are somewhere between 3 to 5. So it's likely twice them. So if you think of all the effort the EU is putting into reducing its emissions, all the attention paid on international aviation to bring their emissions somehow under the Paris Agreement, it's absolutely essential if we're to limit global warming that military emissions have to be brought in to the equation. So why do we have the problem? Well, under the Paris Agreement, in fact, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Paris Agreement is an instrument negotiated under the Framework Treaty, the entity that informs parties to the convention, the national governments, on how they report their emissions, which they're obliged to do under the treaty. These are guidelines that are published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. The IPCC does assessment reports, which come out every 7 years, plus special reports, which synthesize and consolidate and assess all the peer-reviewed research that's done about climate science, how we know the climate's changing and how we project it's going to change, and how we know it's due to human causes, the impacts and risks and vulnerability of human and natural systems to those impacts and risks from climate change, and also mitigation, what it is we can do about it following up. So the IPCC, in addition, provides guidance about how greenhouse gas emissions need to be reported. And as we've heard, due to various decisions made during these negotiations, whilst there is guidance that says military, or at least one aspect of military emissions, military fuel use, can be reported under one of the IPCC categories. It's category 1.A.5, which is other, not otherwise specified. It's not compulsory, it's voluntary. It's not comprehensive because it doesn't take into account all the sources of emission. So we have a lot of absent data, and the data that is provided by the few countries is aggregated, and so we really don't know what's going on. So this is why we have what's called a military emissions gap. So so what's the policy process, and how can we fix this gap? Which, as the other speakers have said, we're really focused here on, the bottom line here is the starting point upon which other activities and advocacy can be based, is to just to get the governments of the world to be reporting comprehensively and in a disaggregated way on their military emissions as part of their annual reporting requirements under the Framework Convention. Well, the Paris Agreement has an instrument called nationally determined contributions. This is where every government has to make a formal statement about what its country's emission reduction efforts are going to be to contribute to global mitigation efforts. Collectively, the world has committed to net zero emissions and to limit global warming to as close to 1.5 degrees possible. And every country has to say what their contributions will be. And these are called naturally determined contributions. And there is an oversight mechanism. It's called the global stocktake every few years. And we're about to get the first major global stocktake, or could be the second, sorry, where each of the country's individual naturally determined contributions are assessed, and they're added up, and an assessment is made of how collectively in aggregate, whether they're on track to achieve net zero emissions and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. The assessment that was made at the end of last year shows that there's a huge gap between what the science is telling us is needed and what current policies as being implemented are achieving. We're currently on track, if nothing were to change, to not 1.5 degrees by the year 2100, but 3 degrees. Okay, so the pressure is really on at this year's COP and the following COPs for countries to increase their mitigation ambition and to do a better job at implementing their commitments under the naturally determined contribution. The fact that the current US administration has said they're going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, what that means is at least for another 4 years, we're going to get a big increase in emissions from one of the major emitters. However, the rest of the world remains committed to, the rest of the world community remains committed to the agreement, including the other two major emitters, China and India and EU. And I would add military emissions if we were to treat them as a global sector. So the bottom line is that the Paris Agreement can only be effective if governments are providing comprehensive and transparent national greenhouse gas inventory reports, so that when the global stocktakes occur, we have accurate estimates of the change in total human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, and we know whether we have to ratchet up people's ambitions, whether policies need to be strengthened, and if so, in which area. So the lack of mandatory, comprehensive and transparent accounting and reporting of military emissions is therefore a major concern. It's a major gap and a major impediment to progressing the implementation of the Paris Agreement. However, this can be addressed quite simply, not in a political sense, but in a technical sense, by revisions to the IPCC and related framework convention reporting frameworks and reporting obligations to ensure that they are comprehensive and transparent and disaggregated, as I've been discussing. This requires the parties to the convention at a COP to have a decision which gives direction to the IPCC to revise their guidelines and come back to the parties to the convention with guidance on how to do this. Because at that point, it's a technical matter, and the IPCC is the institution that's set up to provide that kind of technical advice. And I'll just finish. We have one more issue, though, as both previous speakers have said. The conflict emissions from war and violent armed conflict must also be addressed, because they're not part of what we're talking about, if you like, are the normal military emissions. There's if you look at the top 20 countries for spending, the 20 countries that spend the most on military, in total it was about 1.7 trillion in 2023. All that military complex is an activity generates emissions. That's what we're talking about with the IPCC. But the conflict emissions, the emissions that arise from conflict, they're, if you like, currently being treated in an analogous way to international aviation emissions and international shipping emissions. They're ironically called bunker emissions because they're hidden. and no one can see them. So conflict emissions really are a bunker emission. No one takes responsibility for them. You know, tragically and ironically, if you think about it, the current accounting rule is that emissions are the responsibility of the countries where they occur. So, for example, Australia exports a huge amount of coal and natural gas to other countries. We don't account for those emissions. They're accounted for by the countries that burn them. If Australia were to invade New Zealand and drop bombs on New Zealand, right, all those emissions would be the responsibility of New Zealand.
Of New Zealand.
under the current accounting rules. Obviously, that's nonsensical. So again, I think that the IPCC would also have to be directed that we would need to have some process by which conflict emissions were also brought into the calculation and the calculus.
Thank you, Professor McKay. That has been really insightful, particularly that the technical distinctions and your point about how the process works from the COP to the IPCC, and I'm hoping that people got insight into what that system works like, and you're in fact part of this panel here because you have an insight into what needs to happen next. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're running out of time, but those insights are extremely useful. So I'm going to now invite Teresa, who will talk about what in place of war could contribute to this global effort and how, and particularly her expertise in using art, etc., to get people engaged around the world. So in place of war, a very cool organization. So Teresa, over to you.
Thanks. So our vision is to live in a world where creativity catalyzes change. In Place of War is a global organization that uses artistic creativity in places affected by conflict, climate change, and social injustice. So In Place of War started as a research project in 2004 at the University of Manchester in the UK, exploring the role of arts in sites of conflict. And those initial research findings spurred practical programming and projects. So leveraging, I guess, what we could call our privilege here in the global north to how could we support kind of local grassroots initiatives in global majority countries. And central really to this thinking is what we call our Changemaker network. So we know that local people often are experts in their communities and that they hold kind of invaluable knowledge, and they need to be involved in the process so that they can make the change they want to see. So to this end, we collaborate with an international network across 40 countries of organizations, very grassroots organizations, already using arts in their communities to make social change, calling out social injustice, or also addressing the climate crisis. So we work with these organizations in music, theatre, and across different art forms. And this support takes many different forms. It can be equipment donation, it can be building spaces for creative activity, it can be providing platforms to amplify voices that are often unheard, it can be providing funding and helping people to share stories. We also seek to make the case for the role of the arts in society. So through research activities, so we often collaborate with universities in Europe and also in the UK. And this is about how we can make an evidence base to influence policy, to collect robust data, to generate new insights and perspectives. In recent years, our work has naturally shifted to the issue of climate as it's becoming more of a critical issue with the communities that we work with. I think particularly around the idea of climate injustice and the increasing link, and a very obvious link between climate issues, both as a cause and consequence of conflict. And one question that we often get asked is why art? And probably you wonder what I'm doing on this panel, what is the role of art in a conversation about conflict or climate?
Yes.
And you probably think that art is just a form of entertainment, it's something for fun, maybe you invest in art, you have some nice pictures in your house. But we can see it also as a form of kind of transformation. So we look through history, we can see that art has played a role in mobilizing people. We look at the civil rights movement in the US, or more recently, the Arab Spring. So what is it about art? So it's creative expression is this natural arena to facilitate dialogue and debate. It enables to maybe communicate ideas, express emotions, or share experiences in a safe space, or in a way that might not be possible in conversation. Art can provoke reflection on how people think, act, and then internalize their reality, understand the reality of others, and reimagine, create, and advocate for alternative futures. It can call on people's emotions. It can build communities, raise awareness, and generate new understandings. Given this, art is a powerful process to mobilize people, as we have witnessed in our work over the past 20 years. So how do we build a movement? And this is something that we continually try to do. And moving into the climate space is a journey of discovery. So we're exploring how the arts can be used to distill complex scientific data to win hearts and minds. So this is through one of our flagship projects called 𝐸𝐸. And this is about how we create a movement. How do we draw on research and practice in art-based peace building that we've seen to translate it into the climate space? So 𝐸𝐸 is a global project telling the story of climate change through music, working with indigenous communities, musicians, cultural organizations, scientists, and climate experts and activists. So the project aims to distill complex data, which is sometimes too overwhelming for the general public, to reach people's hearts and minds and to create a call to action. So really, we're thinking here that this arts-based project can provide an accessible entry point into conversations on climate, to work, I guess, with the nuances of everyday stories at both the global and local level. How we connect with nature, our relationship to nature, how resonates, this message resonates with people and generates this idea of making them better custodians of the planet. The hope here is that it foments what we call the Overton window. So this is when an issue becomes mainstreamed and politically acceptable amongst the general public, with then a view that this will then permeate into more formal political spaces. We've always worked at the grassroots level with local-led, devised arts-based responses to challenges, but linking up organisations across the world using arts to advocate for social justice, peace and climate is a really key thing that we do. This helps to build networks, share knowledge, provide collective problem solving and amplify voices. However, working at the grassroots really needs, we need this aspirate, help them to generate these new pathways so they can kind of permeate wider structures, because of course these issues at the grassroots are not sorry, my computer's just crashed a little bit. Yeah, so working at the grassroots, we need to develop new pathways for policy engagement. So working with networks, both in the global north and also in the global south. So an example of this was our 100 Agents of Change project, where we took 100 young people in the UK from what we would call disadvantaged or marginalised backgrounds, so people with disabilities, people from minority backgrounds, so people who are perhaps going to be more affected by climate change, but the ones who are least responsible. So this is the idea of climate injustice. And they learned from collaborating with artists and activists from Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East to develop their own creative responses to climate issues affecting their communities. They were then supported with seed funding and mentoring to develop these projects within their own communities. But of course, then the idea here was to open up spaces. So how can we have these, I guess, often unheard voices with lived experiences, generating new pathways in policy? So this culminated yesterday in an event at UK Parliament where the young people presented their work to decision makers, including the Ministry of Culture and Climate, sharing their learning and making collective demands to advocate for more youth-led arts-based climate action and more support. So this is part of a wider strategy to drive systemic and structural change by creating new pathways for more inclusive, sustainable and impactful policy in which marginalised voices with lived experience on issues are often ignored. So the next part of the journey really is to create these new channels. And our next project is presenting a music-based activity at COP30, so highlighting the issues of water through the experience of Indigenous and global majority female artists and their community.
Thank you, Teresa. I don't need convincing of the power of art. I've seen it in many different parts of the world. I just wish we had better ways of leveraging it, and more power to you and organizations like yours. And that's why you're here, to see how we can bring art to the fore, to mobilize, create forums, etc. Okay, thank you so much. And now we're running out of time, but we still have a bit of time for quick questions and answers. But I'm going to hand over to Vanessa. Vanessa, please, over to you. Share with us, your thoughts on what you've heard so far. in the context of both Africa and the movements that you've been involved for several years in relation to climate, etc. Over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. It's an honor to be on this panel with all these incredible people. What I can say is that after listening to everyone's contributions, I have come to the conclusion that the war on climate is here, and we have a responsibility to raise awareness about it, to build its salience in, the media and also climate policy frameworks. As a climate activist, I have, strongly believed in the power of the people to raise awareness about some of the most brutal challenges in our world. And one of the things that really struck me in this conversation was something that Joel actually mentioned, that the military is responsible for 6% of global emissions. And it made me think about how Africa, a whole continent, is responsible for about 4% of the global emissions. Like, this is such a stark statistic, and I think it should be on the front lines of every newspaper. We cannot, clearly address the climate crisis without addressing the emissions in military activity, from supply chains to actual war and, to rebuilding after war. I also read a study that was published by, the Social Science Research Network, and it found that the climate cost of Israel's war on Gaza could exceed 31 million tons of carbon dioxide, and that is, a carbon footprint that will exceed the emissions of around 100 countries. And again, it made me think about the continent, of Africa. It has 54 countries. So the emissions from, a military activity of one country exceeds more than 100 countries, and yet there is a continent that has 54 countries. So it's really imperative and our responsibility to raise awareness on this issue, as we've seen that, fossil fuels like oil and gas, they are hugely responsible for more than 70% of the CO2 emissions. And what we've had from this conversation is that military activity greatly operates on fossil fuels. So it's important that we emphasize this deep and often overlooked interconnectedness between climate and conflict and military activity. My panelists have also talked about, the devastating impacts on the environment, from pollution to, the food and water security to livelihoods being destroyed, and even biodiversity at that. So it's not just, the war on climate, it's, the war on people, it is the war on our nature, it is the war on our entire planet. So we have an urgent need for a global movement, to call for peace, to call for climate justice, to call for protection, not just for people, but also protection of our planet. One thing that I've realized is that the fight for climate justice is the fight about human lives. It is the fight about our ecosystems. It is the fight about the animals and, every living thing on this planet. So if the war on climate is already here, if the war on our ecosystems, if the war on people is already here, that means its costs are immense. And everyone on this webinar should leave this place ready to make legitimate public narratives about this issue, to raise awareness about it, either through activism or through media. I've seen media do an incredible job in raising the salience of an issue. I saw that with the climate strikes when I joined the Fridays for Future movement in 2019. So it's really possible for this to become, an issue that is highly talked about in media, because the more media talks about it, the more people get to know about it, and the more people are aware about the impact of military activity on our climate, both, or before, during, and after. Then I think we can really build a movement that calls for, that calls for climate justice, that calls for peace, that calls for accountability from the military activities. I will end by saying there is no climate justice without addressing the war on our climate. There is no climate justice without addressing the war on people. There is no climate justice without addressing, the war on our biodiversity. And it is happening right now.
Vanessa, brilliant. Thank you so much. Often it takes little data points being juxtapositioned for us to see how ridiculous certain situations are. And I'm sure you have got your facts checked, and others will be checking it as we speak. But the point you made that Africa's emissions are, did you say 4%? Compared to what was just described as an estimate of 6% from conflicts. That's an op-ed. So let's write one together, and let's see if the Financial Times will publish it, because you need to get this sorts of information out there. So I want to really thank you for bringing that together. Very importantly, bringing your passion. And we've got 10 minutes more now, or 15. I'm going to extend a bit. So all of those who have tuned in, if you can hang on there for another 15 minutes, we'll have questions. I've got lots of questions here that have come up. The first question I'd asked Joel, given you're a filmmaker and you understand the media and how to influence these things. So Joel, if you had an unlimited budget to produce stuff, Joel's giving me a smile now. What's the one thing you would do to change global awareness in the next 24 months? I mean, how can we change into the global awareness? We have the policy dimension. How will the Australian government change? Will it report? I mean, it's not the biggest emitter, but as Brendan said, every country's got to start reporting. What would you do with the power of media and you making beautiful movies and things like that?
I'd probably expand the short little documentary I made and start really exploring the intricacies of the industrial military complex.
Right.
It's an enormous industry globally, as Brendan pointed out. If a lot of that 6% figure that we're banding about is just from the manufacture of weapons and the transportation of weapons. And so, yeah, I'd probably just make a longer documentary.
How much money would you need for that, Joel? A couple of $1 million?
No, $600,000 maybe.
Okay, let's go and raise that.
You're offering, Chandran.
Yeah, let's go and raise that money. There's a lot of people out there, but that's how we create the movement, right? We need information. We need good things that grab people's attention, and your short documentary, as you said, is so powerful. As I noticed, so powerful. But imagine if you went into all the intricacies. I mean, that would be a story, a bit. And I think this would really resonate with people. So Joel, let's see how we can raise that money, that global movement, to get you 600,000 or something like that. Okay. I'd like to then ask Sharosh, and anyone else here can chip in. I mean, this idea that it's 6% of the emissions, I'm no expert, I don't have access to the data, but I thought you alluded to maybe that's an underestimation. My sense is it's probably an underestimation. What is your hunch, and what further research would you do if you had unlimited money?
Well, never ask a researcher about research with unlimited money. That's so I think, as I already mentioned, and we have some references in our report about this, we believe that the current estimation is 10 times less, or basically the emission is 10 times more than what is reported so far. And it comes at the back of, we don't have really transparent data reporting.
So you're saying that 6% would be what?
Well, 10 times more, basically.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. That changes everything.
Yeah, I mean, look, if we don't have transparent, I think there is no doubt that, what is reported is extremely conservative, and it doesn't reflect
Yes.
The
Well, that's why I
factor.
wanted to ask you that question. And, the audience and others we can start to look into it, because that triggers a lot of inquiry. But you think it's about 10 times more?
Yes, and not only us, there are all other reports as well that they
Wow.
confirm this number 10 times more. Yes.
That is amazing.
Wow.
So can I ask?
Very sad reality as well, that such an important issue.
Yes.
And after all these years, we still cannot even report the right number.
I mean, the staggering hypocrisy of politicians turning up at COPs, etc., and talking about this. We saw a bit of that in Joel's excellent video, and so much is hidden deliberately as well. Let's, in our small way, starting today, start to get people excited to contribute in a positive way. Yeah. Brendan, given what Sarosh has just said, and given that, our hope, and there are many others trying to work on this, is to get this onto the agenda the next COP. What do you think, in your ideal scenario, would be an outcome from this initial process? And I would like to also have your view on the underestimation of what the emissions are today.
Well, on that point, I mean, and I think Sarosh knows this better than I, but the last concerted attempt to pull data together, I mean, it was 5.5% in 2019, right? And I looked at the numbers last night, actually, in preparation for this. Military spending globally increased 20%.
Oh, right.
No, between 2021 and 2024, I couldn't get data for any earlier. So, 6% is absolutely a very conservative estimate. And because you mentioned the Australian government, interestingly, does include, like, in its net zero emission commitment, it has a commitment to reducing emissions from the Australian Defence Force, because Defence Forces writ large are more than weapons of war. They employ tens of thousands of people who have houses, and there's massive amounts of transportation, etc. So it'd be interesting. I think there are, but to get back to your question, what would I look for at the COP? The normal pathway by things happen is that civil society organizations are the ones who raise the alarm on issues and produce the evidence base for why issues need to be brought to the agendas. And but ultimately, you require state party members to the treaty, national governments, to bring the issue to the table. So, the opportunity now is to start that process of working with NGO networks, such as the Climate Action Network, who are the main organized civil society body that engages with these treaties on this topic, by talking, as you say, to the countries from the global majority, some of whom don't even have military forces, right? Like, clearly, I would think there's a constituency there amongst governments who just probably have not had the evidence brought to them, and may well be quite open to taking this to the COP dialogue. I mean, that's the most direct route to get things on the agenda. But governments always need civil society there, helping to provide the evidence, giving the supporting, bringing in the experts and the community views, etc., about the significance of this. So you need that parallel strategy, if you like. You need to get a coalition of state party members of governments who are prepared to add this to their agenda. And you need civil society organizations who can help bring the evidence and the experts and the first-hand frontline. I think these frontline reports that Vanessa's talking about and Teresa's talking about, hearing the voice from the communities who are bearing the brunt of the war, so to speak, on climate is very important and necessary. In terms of the COP this year, there's opportunities to get this into formal and informal side events. Many countries have their own pavilion with their own side events. So again, there's many opportunities to be raising awareness about this. And ideally, you would look for a decision from the COP that would direct the IPCC to come back to them with a technical report about how to do it.
What are the chances? Just 10 seconds. What are the chances of the COP doing that? If there's enough information, the report, the video, your good officers, etc., of doing that?
Well, I'm not a gambling man. I don't know about odds, but we know what will happen if we don't try. It won't happen.
That's right. Brendan, thank you so much. Teresa, over to you. Given that we hope to gain momentum, and if you were said, hey, lead a global campaign using art and to energize people, please, in a couple of minutes, tell me what you think we should do and mobilize people around the world.
Yes, I mean, there are different ways of engaging people. We've seen things like subverted advertising in Brazil has been really effective to mobilize masses of people. Again, in places like Africa, we work with an organization in Zimbabwe, which is using satire, so opening up spaces. Again, it's about bringing these conversations into the mainstream. And just to mention something that has kind of emerged from our research findings is actually bringing art into kind of more formal climate activism spaces, is kind of giving them a new repertoire, I guess, to mobilize people. So again, thinking strategically and networks, where are those organizations already working in the climate space? How can we perhaps inject kind of arts-based responses as new ways of engaging people or revitalizing the arguments to kind of mainstream these conversations into, the public spaces?
Thank you, Teresa. And Vanessa, you dropped some very useful information. There are people in the world who, in light of the big conflicts, the Ukraine war and Gaza, keep reminding me about conflicts in other parts of the world. One place is Africa, and you talked about, but as you say, as we all know, the emissions probably pale in comparison to the large sort of industrialized wars that are taking place as well. So as a citizen of Africa, and where, as you pointed out, only 4%, what would you want to say to African governments, given the point made by Professor McKay, that there are countries that are not hugely militarized, but are involved in conflicts, and there are, in Southeast Asia, we have this, in Africa. If you were ambassador for peace, and if this momentum came up, what would you be trying to initiate in Africa to get African leaders also to take note of this, and particularly Dr. Pando's view that if we can get to the point where even if we have differences, but we can stabilize through peace, we not only then start addressing poverty, but we also address the more systemic sort of existential threats of climate.
Yeah, I think I would speak from the place of agency, but not just from emissions, but from the place of people.
Yeah.
Because I personally believe that we should not have war in the first place. Like even though it's, it causes emissions, the biggest impact is on the people. It is on communities that are displaced, people whose lives are lost. I think we are clearly seeing that, in some of the conflicts within Africa, in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Sudan. At the end of it all, it is people. Sometimes we can get taken over by statistics, which I believe are important. But at the end of these statistics, it is people. So if I was an ambassador for peace, I would speak from, the place of agency to protect the livelihoods of people, because no one should have to experience war. I have where I'm studying right now, I have a few friends that have experienced war, and one of the things that they have shared with us has been that you never know when war is going to happen in your country. And that's why conversations on, global security are really, really important. And many of them, they realize that they just woke up one day and everything was gone and they had to run, they had to leave their homes, they had to leave their countries. So no one is an exception. War can happen anywhere. So it's really important that we emphasize the need for peace. We shouldn't need to have war. I think like war just causes a lot of harm, a lot of destruction. And again, I think Joel again pointed out, also Dr. Suresh pointed out how the impacts of war, they don't just end during the war.
Yes.
Like they continue even after the war. And after here, we've mostly talked about like the destruction on, the rebuilding, the emissions, but also the impact on people's lives, people's mental health, and how people rebuild, people that have lost family members. So for me, it's really that place of there shouldn't be war in the first place.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel terrible that I have to close this discussion, but I am also thrilled that we started a conversation that is, in a way, brand new about stuff that is kept away from the limelight. And we've had speakers who have, enlightened all of us. I learned a great deal. The question is, what do we all do next? And I think the first step has been taken now. And my belief is that there's going to be a lot of follow-up. And we will certainly be talking to the people who helped us to do this with our partners, etc., to follow up and get a lot of publicity for this. So I'm going to, first ask everyone who's online to thank our speakers for really the exceptional work they do, the documentary, the study, the work of the IPCC, and the grassroots work that Teresa and Vanessa done. A big thank you to all of you. Really, lots of kudos and respect. Then I'm going to just ask all of you listening in to please advertise this. Take the link to the conference, the webinar, the seminar links, and the YouTube video once it's posted, and go to our website and share it with all your friends. What I like to think big is that we'll have 1 million people following us, this discussion and the follow-up events, perhaps in 6 months. So that's what we'd like to do. We have to work very hard at that. And finally, I'd like to thank our partners who enable this to be done. So the Arava Institute, the China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation, the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation, the Greater Augusttown Film Festival, gift.ed, the Global Alliance for Banking on Values, the Griffith University's Climate Action Beacon in Place of War, the Progressive Climate Foundation, TMRW, the University of Technology Malaysia Center for Environmental Sustainability and Water Security. So I'd like to thank our partners. We've actually reached out to a lot more institutions in the short space we had to put this together. And I'm expecting that the number of institutions who will join this will swell tremendously in the next few months. And everyone who's out there listening, please send us details, information if you need more details of our partners, but also who else do you think should join this global movement. So my time's up, our time's up. I think we've done something rather special today, starting here. And once again, thank you everyone for joining us. And once again, thank you to our panel. Tremendous work, everyone. And have a good day. This is the first step. Let's keep moving. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your week.